The image is iconic, seared into the collective memory of history, the B-17 Flying Fortress. A majestic, four-engine bomber, silver against the blue sky, a formation of them stretching to the horizon, a symbol of American industrial might and strategic air power. It was a fortress, as its name implied, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, a seemingly invincible spearhead in the Allied campaign to dismantle the German war machine from the skies. But for the 10 men sealed inside its thin aluminum skin, this fortress was a prison. A prison flying at 25,000 feet, through a blizzard of steel and fire, where the arithmetic of survival was not just grim, it was a waking nightmare. Behind the patriotic posters and the glorious newsreels lay a terrifying reality. The B-17, for all its formidable reputation, was, in the cold, unfeeling language of statistics, a flying coffin. To understand the terror, one must first understand the numbers. The United States Army Air Forces entered the war with a doctrine of daylight precision bombing. The belief was that tight, self-defending formations of heavily armed bombers like the B-17 could fight their way to the target and back without the need for long-range fighter escorts. This doctrine was about to be tested in the blood of its crews. The air war over Europe was the single most statistically deadly arena for American servicemen. Of all U.S. combat branches, none had a higher casualty rate than the crewmen of the heavy bombers. A man wearing the wings of an Air Force gunner, bombardier, or navigator was not simply a soldier, he was a participant in a lottery where the odds were brutally stacked against him. The initial benchmark for a crew's survival was the completion of 25 missions. This number was not chosen at random, it was a grim calculation based on early, catastrophic loss rates. In the dark days of 1942 and 1943, before the advent of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, the chance of a bomber crew completing their tour was almost nil. During the infamous raids of 1943, such as the second Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission where 60 B-17s were shot down in a single day, the statistical life expectancy of a new crew could be measured in a handful of missions. To be shot down was not an anomaly, it was an expectation. The term flying fortress itself was a dangerous misnomer that belied the machine's profound vulnerability. Their fortress was built of thin aluminum, a material chosen for lightness to allow for bomb load and altitude. It offered no real protection. A 20mm cannon shell from a German fighter could slice through it as if it were paper. The Flak, the German anti-aircraft artillery, was the true arbiter of fate. A jagged piece of shrapnel, no larger than a man's fist, traveling at supersonic speeds, could tear through the fuselage, severing hydraulic lines, electrical cables, oxygen lines, and human limbs with indiscriminate efficiency. There was no armor plating to hide behind. The only thing between a crewman and the frozen, lethal sky was a thin metal skin, often less than 1/10 of an inch thick. Inside this aluminum tube, the men were trapped. For up to 10 hours on a long-range mission to targets deep in Germany, they were confined to their cramped, specialized stations. The ball turret gunner, curled in a fetal position beneath the plane, was locked in place for the entire flight, a solitary target. The waist gunners stood at open windows, exposed to the 60 below zero slipstream and the strafing runs of enemy fighters. There were no panic rooms, no escape pods. In the event of a catastrophic hit, the only way out was through a narrow hatch or a bomb bay, often while the aircraft was spinning, on fire, or breaking apart in midair. This statistical nightmare was not an abstract concept for the crews. It was a daily, grinding psychological weight. They lived with it in the quiet moments before a mission, watching the assignment board. They saw it in the empty bunks at their quarters, the men who had failed to return from the previous day's raid. They calculated it themselves, with a morbid, soldier's humor. They knew that every time they crossed the English Channel on their way out, they were betting their lives that they would be part of the percentage that would cross it again on their way back. They knew that a single, unlucky flak burst could turn their fortress into a funeral pyre, or that a coordinated attack by a swarm of German fighters could decimate an entire formation. The terror of the B-17 was not just the momentary, heart-stopping fear of combat. It was the slow, corrosive dread born from the cold, hard numbers. It was the knowledge that they were flying a machine that was both a weapon and a potential coffin, in a campaign where the calculus of survival was terrifyingly simple, you could only tempt fate so many times before it collected its debt. The aluminum coffin was not just a nickname born from cynicism, it was the stark, statistical reality of the bomber war, a reality every one of the 10 men inside was forced to confront every time their wheels left the ground. The number was both a goal and a ghost, 25. For every B-17 crew arriving in England, this figure represented the finish line, the promised land. Complete 25 missions and you earned a ticket home, a respite from the flak and the fighters, a return to a world without the daily expectation of a violent death. It was the single, shining light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. But in the early years of the air war over Europe, that light was a mirage. The promise of 25 missions was a cruel mathematical fiction, a target set so high that for most, it was utterly unattainable. To understand the psychological landscape of a bomber crew is to understand that they were not just fighting the Luftwaffe, they were waging a war of attrition against probability itself, and the odds were catastrophically stacked against them. The origin of the 25 mission tour was not born from a humane desire to preserve life, but from cold, operational necessity. Command needed a benchmark to maintain morale and to cycle through experienced crews who could then train new arrivals. Yet, when the 8th Air Force began its major bombing campaign in earnest in 1942 and 1943, the loss rates rendered this benchmark almost laughable. During this period, a crew's chance of completing a tour was statistically zero. In some of the most brutal raids, the Black Thursday of the 2nd Schweinfurt raid, where 60 bombers were lost, or the Regensburg mission, the loss rates could exceed 20, 30, or even 40% in a single day. When the statistical probability of being shot down on any given mission was 1 in 5, the chance of surviving 25 such missions was a fraction of a percent. It was a lottery of death, and every man held a ticket. This mathematical reality cultivated a unique and dark culture among the airmen. They were not optimistic, they were fatalistic. They spoke of the law of averages with a grim reverence, believing that every safe return only increased the likelihood of being shot down on the next one. They lived in a world of ominous rituals and superstitions. A navigator might insist on carrying the same lucky scarf, now stained and tattered, on every mission. A pilot might follow the exact same pre-flight routine, tapping a specific part of the fuselage before climbing aboard. To deviate was to tempt fate. They avoided talking about life after the war, as if it were a jinx. The future was a luxury they could not afford. Their world was compressed into the next mission, and the one after that. The goal was not to complete the tour, but simply to survive the day. It was within this culture that the concept of the lucky ones was born. These were not necessarily the most skilled pilots or the sharpest gunners, though skill certainly played a part. They were the crews who seemed to have a charmed existence, the ones who defied the statistics through a combination of fortune, instinct, and perhaps divine intervention. They were the planes that returned with over 300 flak holes, yet no vital systems were hit and no crewmen injured. They were the ones who lost 2 engines but managed to limp back across the channel, landing on a prayer and fumes. They were the fortresses that survived mid-air collisions, that flew through swarms of fighters and lived to tell the tale. Their names and their aircraft became legends, symbols of hope in a world devoid of it. To fly with a lucky crew was to feel a fleeting sense of protection in an otherwise unprotected existence. But for every lucky crew, there were a dozen that vanished. The men lived with a constant, grinding awareness of their own expendability. They saw the evidence every day. They returned from a mission to find rows of empty hardstands where their comrades' planes had been parked. They sat in the mess hall and noticed the sudden quiet at a neighboring table. They wrote letters to the families of men they had known for only a few weeks. The replacement crews that arrived were given the beds and the lockers of the dead. There was no time for proper mourning, the machinery of war demanded that the empty spaces be filled, the cycle continued. A man could have breakfast with a friend and by supper, that friend would be listed as missing in action over enemy territory. The psychological toll of this relentless pressure was immense. Men suffered from what was then called combat fatigue or flak happiness. It was a state of nervous exhaustion, characterized by tremors, insomnia, irrational fears, and a hollow-eyed stare. The sound of a backfiring truck could send a veteran gunner diving for cover. Some men reached their breaking point, unable to strap themselves into the aluminum coffin for one more trip. The military, recognizing this, eventually instituted a policy where a crewman could be taken off combat duty after a severe enough psychological breakdown, but this was often seen with a mixture of pity and envy by those who continued to fly. The completion of a 25-mission tour was so rare in the early days that it was cause for a monumental celebration. The lucky crew that achieved the impossible became instant celebrities. Their final mission was often flown with a sense of surreal euphoria and sheer terror, a final dance with the Reaper. Upon landing, they were mobbed. They were given a bottle of whiskey, a ceremony, and that precious ticket home. But even for these few, the victory was bittersweet. They were leaving behind a family of men who still had to fight, men who looked at them with hopeful, haunted eyes, wondering if they would ever be so lucky. And their lucky ones themselves carried the war home inside them, the memories of friends lost, the close calls, the sound of flak and the screams on the interphone. They had beaten the odds, but the odds had left their mark. The 25 missions were not just a number, they were a trial by fire that forever separated the living from the dead, and the lucky from the lost. The Luftwaffe and flak were named enemies, threats the crew could fight back against with .50 caliber bullets and evasive action. But there was a third, silent adversary on every mission, one that was utterly indifferent to their courage, their formations, or their corps. It was a foe that permeated the very air they flew in, a relentless, draining presence that sapped their strength, clouded their judgment, and killed as efficiently as any German fighter pilot. This enemy was the cold. At 25,000 feet, in the unpressurized, thinly-skinned fuselage of AB-17, the crew was not just flying through the air, they were inhabiting a near-space environment, a realm where the ambient temperature could plummet to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Their battle was not merely against the Germans below, but for survival against the elemental physics of altitude itself. To experience the cold of AB-17 at cruise altitude was to experience something beyond normal human comprehension. It was not the crisp chill of a winter morning, but a deep, invasive, metallic cold that leached heat from the body with terrifying speed. The metal of the aircraft itself became a conductor of this frigidity. To touch the fuselage with bare skin was to risk an instant, severe frostbite burn. The moisture from a man's breath would freeze on his oxygen mask, his mustache, and his eyelashes, forming a crust of ice. Inside the cabin, a fine, glittering mist of frozen condensation, ice crystals, would often hang in the air, stirred by the drafts that whistled through the countless gaps in the airframe. The first and most critical line of defense against this environment was the flight suit. Each crewman was issued a bulky, electrically heated suit that plugged into the aircraft's electrical system. It was a technological marvel in theory, but a constant source of anxiety in practice. The suits were notoriously unreliable. A worn wire, a faulty connection, a blown fuse, any small failure could render the suit useless, plunging a man into a fight for his life in a matter of minutes. Over this, they wore a heavy, leather-padded, shirling-lined suit, giant boots, and thick gloves. Despite this cocoon of fabric and wiring, the cold always won. It seeped in through the seams, it bit at any exposed inch of skin, and it slowly, inexorably drained the body's core temperature. A waist gunner, standing at his open window with the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream screaming past, was in a particularly desperate situation. The wind chill factor could drive the effective temperature down to an unimaginable -100 degrees Fahrenheit. He was a man stationed in a hurricane of ice. The second lifeline, as critical as ammunition, was oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the air is too thin to sustain human consciousness for more than a few minutes. Without a constant supply of pure oxygen, a man would succumb to hypoxia, a gradual, often euphoric, loss of mental faculties leading to unconsciousness and death. The crew's oxygen masks were their literal breath of life. But here, too, the cold was the enemy. The moisture in a man's exhaled breath would freeze inside the rubber tubes of the oxygen system, creating dangerous blockages of ice. A crewman had to constantly monitor his own mental state and that of his comrades for the subtle, insidious signs of hypoxia, a bluish tint to the lips and fingernails, a sense of foolish well-being, sluggish thinking, or a failure to respond to commands. A frozen oxygen line was a silent, invisible killer that could strike a man down at his post without a single shot being fired. Beyond the direct physical threat, the cold was a relentless psychological and operational drain. It made every task, no matter how simple, a monumental effort. A gunner trying to traverse his stiff, frozen turret had to fight against the congealed grease in the gears. A navigator's fingers, numb and clumsy inside his thick gloves, would fumble with his maps and sextant. The simple act of reloading a .50 caliber machine gun became a complex, painful ballet of frozen metal and stiff limbs. The cold bred a unique, profound exhaustion. The body, burning calories at a furious rate just to maintain its core temperature, was in a constant state of energy depletion. After a 6 to 8 hour mission, crews would return to base not just mentally shattered from combat stress, but physically wrecked, their bodies hollowed out by the effort of simply staying warm and alive. And then there was the ice. As the bomber flew through cloud layers or areas of supercooled moisture, layers of rime ice would begin to accrete on the wings, the propellers, and the plexiglass noses and turrets. This was not a mere inconvenience, it was a direct and immediate threat to the aircraft's ability to fly. Ice on the wings disrupted the smooth airflow, destroying lift. A buildup of just a half-inch of ice could be enough to send a heavily laden B-17 into an uncontrollable stall. Ice on the propellers created violent, destructive vibrations that could shake an engine off its mounts. For the pilots, fighting the controls as the aircraft grew heavier and more sluggish, the formation around them fading behind a wall of white frost, the battle against ice was some of the most white-knuckled flying of the entire war. They would frantically engage de-icing boots, rubber membranes on the leading edges of the wings that would inflate and crack the ice off, but these systems were not always effective, and they too could be disabled by the very cold they were meant to combat. This was the hidden, terrifying side of the bomber war. A crew could fly to the target and back without ever seeing an enemy fighter, without a single flak burst exploding near them, and still be in a desperate, life-or-death struggle. They were fighting an environment that was fundamentally alien and hostile to human life. The killing cold was a reminder that their true opponent was not just the German military, but the very laws of nature. It was a battle fought in silence, a slow, grinding war of attrition against their own bodies and their machine, a constant, shivering proof that the sky itself was the most unforgiving battlefield of all. If the German fighters were the swift, surgical scalpel of the Luftwaffe, then the flak was the blunt, brutal hammer. For the crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the fighters represented a threat they could engage, a duel they could theoretically win with skill and firepower. But the flak, the German anti-aircraft artillery, was different. It was an impersonal, omnipresent force of nature. It was a storm of steel through which they had to fly, a mathematical nightmare where survival was not a matter of courage or marksmanship, but of pure, random chance. The experience of flying through a concentrated flak field was a unique form of psychological torture, a period of helpless, agonizing waiting that etched itself into the soul of every man who endured it. The term flak itself comes from the German Fliegerabwehrkanone, meaning aviator defense cannon. But for the men of the 8th Air Force, it was known by other names, Akak, or simply, the stuff. Its presence was announced long before the first black puff appeared. The initial warning was a low, rhythmic wump-wump-wump felt more through the airframe than heard, the sound of the massive 88mm and 105mm guns firing from the ground miles below. Then, the sky ahead would begin to bloom. The first explosions appeared as innocent, small black smudges, like dirty cotton balls. But as the formation drew closer, the reality became terrifyingly clear. Each of those puffs was the detonation of a high-explosive shell, designed not to score a direct hit, but to fill a large volume of air with thousands of jagged, red-hot shards of steel shrapnel. Flying through this was the non-negotiable part of the mission. To reach the target, the bombers had to fly a straight and level bomb run for several agonizing minutes. This was the moment of supreme vulnerability. Evasive action was forbidden, the bombardier in the lead plane needed a stable platform to sight the target. The formation became a slow-moving, predictable train in the sky, and the German gunners on the ground knew it. They would box a formation, creating a three-dimensional cube of explosions through which the bombers had to fly. The sound inside the plane was deafening, a continuous, concussive crump 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 that hammered the ears and shook the aircraft like a dog with a rat. The plane would buck and shudder violently with each nearby blast. The randomness was the most terrifying aspect. There was no dodging flak. A man's life depended on the trajectory of a shell fired miles away, its fuse set by an unknown gunner, its fragmentation pattern an unpredictable variable. A B-17 could fly through the heart of the barrage and emerge unscathed, while a plane flying a seemingly clear path a few hundred yards away could take a direct hit and vanish in a fireball. This utter lack of control was psychologically devastating. The crew was reduced to a state of passive endurance. They were passengers in their own potential coffin, their fate decided by a lottery of steel. All they could do was sit at their stations, watch the black puffs grow closer, listen to the shrapnel rattle against the fuselage like deadly hail, and wait. The damage inflicted by a flak burst was horrifyingly efficient. A direct hit was often instantly catastrophic, tearing wings off or igniting fuel and bombs. But it was the near misses that created the unique, grinding horror of the flak field. A single piece of shrapnel, no larger than a coin, could be traveling at supersonic speeds. It could slice through the aluminum skin as if it were tissue paper. Its path of destruction was indiscriminate. It could sever a control cable, leaving the pilots helpless. It could puncture a hydraulic line, draining the fluid needed for the gun turrets and flaps. It could shred the intricate oxygen lines, asphyxiating the crew one by one. Most terrifyingly, it could find its way into the human body. A jagged piece of steel would scream through the cabin, taking off a limb, tearing open a torso, or decapitating a man where he stood, painting the interior with a sudden, shocking burst of red. For the men inside, the flak run was a sensory overload of terror. They could see the black clouds blooming around them, sometimes so thick they blotted out the sun. They could feel the concussive blasts slamming into the aircraft. They could hear the ping and thwack of shrapnel impacts. And they could smell it, the acrid, bitter odor of cordite from the exploding shells would seep into the cabin, a constant olfactory reminder of the violence outside. The interphone, normally a channel for terse commands and warnings, would often fall silent during the worst of the barrage, each man locked in his own private hell, waiting for the impact that would end him. The psychological aftermath of a severe flak beating was as real as any physical wound. Men would return from a mission flak happy, a term for what we now recognize as severe combat stress or PTSD. They would be jumpy, irritable, their nerves shot. The sound of a car backfiring or a door slamming could trigger a paralyzing flashback. They developed a 1,000-yard stare, their eye seeing not the English countryside but the endless, exploding sky. The experience of flying through a flak field, of being passively shot at for minutes on end with no ability to respond, created a deep, visceral trauma that many carried for the rest of their lives. The flak field was the great equalizer. It didn't matter how experienced a pilot was, how accurate a gunner was, or how lucky a crew had been. When they entered that box of black smoke and steel, they were all equally helpless. It was a trial not of skill, but of sheer endurance, a brutal gauntlet where survival was a gift bestowed by chance, not earned by merit. For the men of the B-17, the fighters were a threat they could face with defiance, but the flak was a storm they could only endure with hope, and a prayer that their number was not yet up. The flak was a terror of probability, a random storm of steel. But when the fighters came, the threat became personal. It had a shape, a speed, and a terrifying intent. The impersonal chaos of the flak field was replaced by the focused, predatory violence of the Luftwaffe. This was no longer a matter of chance, it was a duel. The .50 caliber machine guns of the Flying Fortress were no longer for show, they were the only thing standing between the crew and a swift, fiery death. The arrival of the German fighter swarm was the moment the theoretical defense of the B-17 was put to the ultimate test, and for the young men inside, it was the most intensely frightening, adrenaline-fueled experience of their lives. The warning often came first from the radio. A calm, strained voice from the formation leader, fighters. 10 o'clock high. Or it came from a sharp-eyed gunner, his voice rising in pitch over the interphone, bandits. Bandits at 3 o'clock level, coming in fast. However the alert came, it triggered an instantaneous, electric surge of dread and readiness throughout the aircraft. The languid, cold boredom of the long flight evaporated, replaced by a hyper-awareness that narrowed time and focus to the immediate, lethal present. Gunners strained against their harnesses, hands gripping the cold triggers, their eyes scanning the vast, empty sky that was about to become a killing ground. The German tactics were brutal and effective. They rarely attacked alone. The preferred method was the massed, head-on pass, the Verbenspaket, or formation package. A swarm of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s, sometimes numbering in the dozens, would form up several miles ahead of the bomber stream. Then, in a line abreast formation, they would dive at a closing speed of over 600 miles per hour, their wings lit by the bright flashes of their 20mm cannons and machine guns. The goal was to break the formation, to pick off the lead ships, and to sow chaos. For the bomber crews, the sight was surreal and horrifying, a line of specks on the horizon that grew with impossible speed into identifiable enemy aircraft, their noses glowing with continuous fire, aimed directly at them. Inside the B-17, the world dissolved into a cacophony of noise and violence. The steady drone of the engines was drowned out by the staccato, jackhammer roar of the .50 caliber machine guns. Each turret, the top, ball, tail, and waist guns, blazed away, filling the plane with the deafening thunder of its own defense. The air filled with the pungent smell of cordite from the spent shell casings that cascaded onto the floor, piling up around the gunners' feet. The interphone became a chaotic chorus of shouts and warnings, often overlapping and frantic. "He's coming around again. I'm hit. I'm hit. Fighter going down at 6 o'clock. Left waist, watch that one on our tail." For the gunners, this was their moment of supreme responsibility and extreme vulnerability. A waist gunner, standing at his open window, was exposed to the freezing slipstream and the incoming fire. He had to track a target moving at blinding speeds, leading it with his tracers, all while knowing that the enemy pilot was doing the same to him. The ball turret gunner, curled in a fetal position beneath the plane, was the most isolated man in the crew. He was a target from every angle, his world a spinning panorama of sky, earth, and attacking fighters. A direct hit on his plexiglass sphere was almost always fatal. The psychological pressure was immense. A moment's hesitation, a missed shot, could mean the death of everyone on board. The physics of a fighter attack were brutally simple. The B-17's .50 caliber bullets could destroy a German fighter, but it often took a sustained burst in a critical area. The German fighters, however, were armed with 20mm and even 30mm cannons. A single, well-placed 20mm high-explosive shell could tear a wing off a B-17 or ignite its fuel tanks. The bombers were not agile, they could not dive, twist, or turn like their attackers. Their defense lay in the mutually supporting fire of the tight formation, the concept of their box. Each fortress protected its neighbors, creating a crossfire that made a direct assault suicidal for a fighter pilot. But if the formation was broken, if a plane lagged behind with damaged engines, it became a straggler, and the fighters would swarm it like wolves on a wounded caribou, showing no mercy. The aftermath of a fighter pass was a scene of stark contrast. The roaring guns would fall silent, leaving a ringing in the ears. The frantic shouts on the interphone would subside into terse damage reports. The crew would take a collective, shuddering breath, their bodies buzzing with spent adrenaline. But the respite was temporary. They would scan the skies, counting the cost. A nearby B-17 might be trailing smoke, its number 3 engine dead. Another might be spinning down, a wing missing, with only a few parachutes blossoming in its wake. The formation would tighten up, closing the gaps left by the lost aircraft. The gunners would check their ammunition counts, their hearts still pounding, knowing that the swarm could reform and come at them again from another direction at any moment. This cycle of anticipation, violent engagement, and tense recovery defined the fighter threat. It was a more active terror than the flak, but in some ways, it was just as psychologically draining. The flak was a force of nature, the fighters were a conscious, intelligent enemy dedicated to their destruction. The swarm represented the human face of the enemy in the air war, a skilled, determined, and deadly adversary. For the crew of the B-17, surviving a fighter attack was a testament to their training, their teamwork, and the sheer defensive firepower of their fortress. But it was also a stark reminder that their aircraft was not the invincible fortress of legend, but a tenuous sanctuary in a sky ruled by hunters. Every successful defense was a victory snatched from the jaws of a swarm that was always waiting, always watching, and always eager to attack again.